Hello everyone, and welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video, what I want to do is I want to go through an example of k-means from start to finish. And what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about our example is going to be based on this spectral plot down here. And then these things here are some of the parameters. We haven't really talked about parameterizing k-means, but basically k-means, the algorithm takes in quite a few different parameters, especially depending on what framework you're using. But the most important are the number of classes that you want, the maximum number of times you want that iteration to go for before you stop, and then the minimum number of samples per cluster. And this is to prevent something like, say, these two pixels taking up an entire cluster, right? When these may be erroneous data or noisy data that we don't want to concern ourselves with, but yet they would take up an entire cluster or an entire class if we weren't careful. Or maybe we wanted that and we would need to take that into account. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take these three parameters. We're going to try and make 4 classes. We're not going to let the thing run more than 6 times. And we're only going to have a minimum of 3 points per cluster. So let's take a look at our first step of k-means here. Right, so our first step, like we said before, was to generate the random center seeds. So we have our 4 clusters because we specified 4 cluster points here. And so we can see here that our 4 cluster centers are the green, the purple, the pink, and the orange. And we've just sort of randomly picked those points because they exist within our the range of our data set. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Step 2, right? We assign pixels based on the closest distance. So each one of these dots has now been color-coded based on the cluster center that it is closest to. So you can see that everything in green is closest to green, and everything in blue is closest to blue. Okay, pink to pink, and orange to orange. Okay, so this is step 2. We've assigned pixels to the closest center. Now step 3, right, we move the pixels. We move the cluster centers. So if we go back for a second, scroll back and forth, you can see that what I've done here is I've brought the cluster centers now to be in what's called the centroid of these new values. You don't need to necessarily worry about what that means for this course, but basically these centers now represent the center of the data, right? So before, right, pixels were assigned based on the closest. Now we've moved the center to the center of those new data. So the green center here now is in the center of the green data. Okay, that was step 3. Now step 4, right, we update the pixels based on the new centers because we moved the centers. Now we reevaluate and say, hey, do we change any assignments? And you can see here that we actually do change assignments on a couple, right? If we scroll back, you'll see that some of these changed assignment and that some of these changed assignment. All right, so we actually have changed assignment. Okay. So now what we do with step 5 is we iterate, right? We repeat steps 3 and 4 until we have some portion of the pixels that don't change classes, right? Again, we've stabilized the system, or the maximum number of iterations. So 6, we get to try this 6 times, one or the other, whichever comes first. Okay, so let's go ahead and just quickly walk through what that will look like. So iteration 2, right, we update the cluster centers. So we move the cluster centers based on where the data was before, right? And then we update pixel assignments. And you can see that we've actually changed some pixel assignments again, right? We do this again, right? We move the cluster centers, update pixel assignments, right? Do it again, move the cluster centers, update the pixel assignments. Okay? But if you notice something, we move the pixel centers, update the pixel assignments. And if you notice something, right, between 3 and 4, right, there wasn't a whole ton of movement. But between 4 and 5, right, nothing seemed to change, right? The pixels didn't change assignments, which is one of our end conditions, right? So we've said, okay, the pixels haven't changed assignments, we can stop, right? So we're done. We've reached our end state, okay? So just to reiterate, right, this is where we started. We have the points that have not been assigned to any sort of clusters, and we have our random cluster labels. And then if we run through that, right, you can see that we end up at this point here where we have a cluster, a cluster, a cluster, and a cluster. Now, we'll talk about analysis in the next video, but you might look at this and you might say, well, these maybe should be two clusters, or maybe this should be its own cluster. But you have to remember, one, we said 4 classes, right? So if we split this in half, it would be 5, which we can't do. And we also said that the minimum number of points in a class has to be 3 or more. So this can't be its own class because it would be too small, okay? So again, hopefully this sort of walkthrough makes a little more sense of what k-means does. Again, I'm not expecting you to understand the math behind it, but just get an idea of this is how these sorts of things, generally speaking, tend to work. So in the next video, we'll talk about what to do after you've run k-means. So if you have any questions, please reach out, and thank you.